So I'm going to show you now a video, and it's a video of someone thinking. She's alone in a room, she's reading a description of an environment, as if you were walking through this town or seeing all the landmarks from above. But she's reading it, and she needs to remember it, okay? So I'm going to show you, if I can get my cursor. So watch her hands, because that's critical. No one told her to do that. She decided, and 70% of our subjects, when we give them these descriptions to read, do exactly what she's doing. They each have their own style, but they're essentially making a map with their hands. They're using lines for paths and points for landmarks, okay? Note that she's not looking at her hands.
Next.
Okay, she's not looking at her hands. She's just doing that spatial motor action, which is encoding what she's reading, okay? But she doesn't have the benefit of seeing. Now, paper is a new invention, right, relatively to humankind, but it does allow us an extra step, and that's looking at the sketch, looking at what the hand has created, and interacting with it. And first of all, when she makes gestures, she has better memory and she makes better inferences. We ask questions from different perspectives, and if you've gestured, you're better at the task. If we make you sit on your hands, your performance declines. So the gesturing, this spatial motor code, is clearly helping her thinking, and we think actually the gestures are encoding the language into thought. That's controversial. But again, they don't look at their hands, so whatever is helping her and him is spatial motor. So sketches have been called frozen gestures. Now they're different because gestures can be in the air and they can have a three-dimensionality. When we put something on a page, we're forced to make it flat. It changes what the hand does and what appears. So, but they do give feedback. So this is something we've been studying in a number of contexts. One is architectural sketches, and Gabi will talk more about that in a minute, and her work was an inspiration for ours. So this is a sketch that one of our experienced architects drew. It's work with Masaki Suwa. I'll talk a little bit more about it. But architects talk about, or designers, having a conversation between the eye and the hand and the marks on the page. A graduate student who was working with me, Andrea Kantrowitz, applied that same technology to artists. She took 9 practicing sketchers, artists for whom drawing was their major form of art. She had them draw a picture and then retrospectively explain what they were doing. And their comments are extraordinary. First, they couldn't talk while they were drawing. It interfered. Language interferes. But they did talk about the ideas emerging from the page. They didn't know what they were drawing. They got themselves in trouble deliberately by not following their usual tricks of drawing, and then they had to get themselves out of trouble. And the ideas emerged from the page. They changed. So her dissertation is lovely on that. So this is the correct quote. From Clay, I had it in there anyway. Sketches are lines on a page, and Clay said, a line is a dot that went for a walk. Right. It's translated from German, but it's right about that. So I've been obsessed by lines. And obsessed by lines are created by the mind. I'll show you in a minute. Lines are created in the world, and I'll show you. Lines are created by our feet walking along the world. Lines are created by our hand on the page. So what connects them all? So these are lines the mind create. This cube here isn't here, right? Your mind made it. And the contours of this horse and rider aren't here. Your mind made it. So our mind is looking for, our visual system is looking for lines that allow us to get objects. That's an important part of our visual world, is distinguishing objects from ground. It's not always easy. It's been hard to get computers to do that, but our mind does it. Okay, so our mind creates lines. We have lines created in the world, right? I mean, gravity has something to do with it. This is Edmond de Waal. And this is familiar to anyone who's walked around town. Right. Lines created in the world. These are the lines that are created by our feet as we walk and then put into sketch maps as we walk around the world. Lines created by the hand. We're all after Gary's sketches, right? But there are lines, these are tally marks in bones that are about 40,000 years old. Lines. One object, one line for accounting. How much taxes do you owe, depending on how many sheep you have. Lines used in diagrams, the periodic table. Lines, this is somebody's social network. Lines are connecting the people in her life. Okay, this is another Steinberg who knew about lines right implicitly. So here he is drawing. This takes up a wall even bigger than this, and you can see it sometimes on display. Here's the top of the this is the Grand Canal, clothesline, the sidewalk from above, the Nile, a railroad bridge, the top of a table, the ceiling. The line keeps changing meaning, but the context tells you what it means. Okay, so the marks we put on the page have a sort of rudimentary semantics that cuts across all kinds of things, not everything, so this is rudimentary, but dots, lines, and blobs have meanings. Dots represent places on route maps, they represent ideas in concept maps, they represent people in social networks. The lines connect them. They connect the places, the landmarks, they connect the ideas, they connect the people, okay? So that's the kind of minimal diagram, is dots and lines that are representing connections between some kind of thought. Blobs are areas or circles. They enclose lots of things, or they might represent regions. So there's a longer story behind that, not for here. So going back to designing and finding ideas, I was struck last year, I had the privilege of hearing Thomas Heatherwick talk about a number of his amazing projects. And one startling thing he said is, I don't get this difference between products and buildings and so forth. He said, I design ideas. And sure enough, this is the chair. It's a lot of fun if you haven't tried it, right? It's wonderful to watch people. They think they're going to go upside down, and they don't. So it's quite a masterpiece. The closing ceremony in the Shanghai Olympics, which was amazing. The British Pavilion and the Shanghai Expo, again, amazing. Okay, so I don't have time to talk about those. But the question is, if you're Heatherwick and designing ideas, how do you get a new one? And he did talk about that process. But we've gotten it into the laboratory, not the months and staff that he uses for it. So you start with an old one, and indeed he did. You start with an old one for the closing ceremony. He said he looked at every single closing ceremony there was, found that it was all an instant, and he had to design an instant. So you start with an old one, but then what? Okay, you got a bunch of old ideas, what do you do? So one way of dealing with old ideas is to take apart the old ones and put them back together, decompose and reconfigure. And that's in fact what our architects said they were doing. So Masaki carefully tracked what the architects were saying retrospectively about every mark they made on the page. And they said they made new discoveries in their sketches when they reconfigured. So the ambiguity helped them reconfigure. Then they got a new idea, and we could see that was a productive cycle. We also saw that our experienced architects were better at that than our novices. We took professionals in either case. So reconfiguring seemed like a good idea, and we brought that into the laboratory, asking undergraduates to come up with new ideas for each of these sketches. So we would show them one, come up with an interpretation. We'd show it again, new interpretation. new interpretation until they ran out. So we gave them these 4 kinds of drawings, and we looked at the number of new interpretations they came up with, and we asked them how they did it. And the people who were good at finding new interpretations said we took it apart and reconfigured. Again, there's ambiguity here. So we thought, okay, interesting. Let's see if we can get people to do it. But first of all, we sort of developed a theory that we called constructive perception. And that's coordinating your perception with idea generation, with conceptual generation. And there are 2 components. One is reconfiguring the perception. And we found that an embedded figures task predicted who was good at that. And then generating new interpretations, and we found a remote association of verbal tasks that showed who was good at that. These 2 abilities are independent, but they're both needed to promote new ideas, or they were both useful. People high on each of those were better than people low. And the ambiguity, again, helps. If something's very rigid, you can't reinterpret, it's harder to reinterpret. Okay, so we brought that into the laboratory with those ambiguous sketches. This is now with Julia Chow. And we gave people 2 strategies for finding new ideas. And one was reconfigure, this bottom-up strategy, perceptual strategy. The other was think of new categories that these sketches could be. So generate lots of new categories: furniture, kitchen appliances, outdoor scenes, whatever. We gave them some examples. And then we looked at, again, the number of ideas. And to our surprise, so this is again, to our surprise, only the conceptual hint worked. So only this top-down, think of lots of new categories, worked for these novices. So what the architects are reporting maybe takes expertise and practice, and our undergraduates or graduates weren't so great at that. So what do conceptual hints do? One thing they do is they release you from fixation. So if I keep seeing that thing that looked like an orange juice maker as an orange juice maker, then if I think of it as a new kind of thing, I can maybe get out of that set of seeing it as only an orange juice maker. So you get released from this perceptual fixation. It's also a productive cue. There are lots of categories, so lots of ways to search. And it's abstract or general. Okay? So let's see. Creativity has been in the news a lot. Maybe you missed it, but in our news it's been there. And you know, every week it seems like somebody's producing another startling experiment. Like if you have a messy desk, you're more creative. Take heart, right, in your messy desk. And there I think the ambiguity of a messy desk is what's helping. Taking a walk makes you more creative, okay? And then the most startling of all is mind wandering makes you more creative. Now, I think any of you who are designers or artists know taking a break and all that works, but you're still thinking about what you're working on. And so total mind wandering doesn't work and it's just wandering. So this sort of bothered me, this idea that mind wandering, and you know, again, it made the press. Turns out the study showing it was flawed. I can explain why in another minute, but I won't now. So mind is the magic word. If you talk about mind wandering, it makes the headlines. If you talk about mindfulness, which is quite the opposite, then it makes the headlines. The idea is you should use the mind, and also it's in the brain, okay? So it's in the brain, and in fact this work on mind wandering did rely on something called the default network, which is supposed to be what's active when you're not doing a specific task, and is supposed to be general, and then it turns out this default network is quite specific and not unitary. There are different default networks that happen at different points, so it's not like it's a solid, you don't want to rest anything on it. So those tasks that looked at mind wandering used a new uses task. So it's no longer dealing with sketches, but, and this is standard in product design courses, engineering, is think of new uses for a chair, a flashlight, and so forth. We picked our objects, we pre-tested them and found ones that were particularly productive, used those. One experiment did compare pictures and words, and if you ask me, I'll tell you about that. And we gave 3 mindsets to people. Either mind wandering, we said an approved way of being more creative, finding new uses, is to let your mind wander. We gave people another way of thinking, and this is a human-centric approach that's used in design. Again, we pre-tested this a lot, and that's imagine different people. What would they do with this object? So we said, think of an artist, think of a gardener, think of a policeman, think of an engineer, think of a physician. What would they do with this object? Okay, so we have a lot of information about different roles in the world. And that can call up just a lot of uses. So it turns out to be extremely productive. The human-centric approach, and again, that's used in the IDEO and many of the top design firms. I don't know what happened to my bullet point here, but it disappeared. So, and then the other mindset that we gave people was mind wandering. So we have, oops, that's just a mistake. That should be control. So we have 3 mindsets, mind wandering, human-centric, think of different professions, and we gave them, or just think. We didn't tell them any instructions at all. So these are the data, and I'm going to show you 3 sets of data quickly, but you'll have to remember the middle column is always the human-centric. This is more uses, and the human-centric was best. This is mind-wandering, this is control. They're about equal. And we did ask the control subjects what they were doing, and they mostly said, well, I was letting my mind wander. So the control was doing more or less what the mind wandering was, and they're not as effective in getting new uses. We also found that the human-centric led to more unique uses and to more original ones. We defined original uses as ones used by only 1 or 2% of the people. We have a huge sample. So then this was Juliet's dissertation, and really quite good. So I just let my mind wander and it didn't come back, or my mind keeps wandering, don't worry, it won't go too far. So I think mind wandering we've shown, isn't such a great strategy. The conceptual hints, top down again, worked better. So mindfulness was better than mind wandering, and I think they can both again release fixation. And these are old psychological phenomena that if you change the stimulus environment, you get new ideas and you break fixation. So breaking fixation is often important, but the top down gives you a way to search. Mind wandering doesn't give you a way to search for ideas. And again, those of you who are designers and artists know very well that each of you, or I think, each of you has your own tricks for releasing fixation and getting new ideas. I have a good friend who's a crack interior designer, and she says, when I get stuck in a design, I go to an art museum. Right? And I sort of asked, well, you're dealing 3D space art is 2D on a wall. She said it works. So everybody has their own way of kind of breaking set and getting. So, and the human-centric, so how can we generalize that? And I think we can generalize it. What the human-centric does is make you take new perspectives. So if you're negotiating between warring parties, you've got to take new perspectives. If you're negotiating a building that you're building, right, you've got to take new perspectives. The perspective of the client, right, and the builders, I mean, architects have to take so many perspectives to function in this world. So so I think it's a general sort of thing of just taking new perspectives. Now, what new perspectives should you take, and how to get them depends very much on the context of your design. Okay, so another way to go abstract, I'm getting near the end, is simply context or juxtaposition. And maybe this is what my friend who's an interior decorator is saying when she goes to an art museum. So this is, again, in the context of art. I've been working with another graduate student in art education and cognitive studies who's interested in museum education. And what do you put on the wall and how do you juxtapose them? So we have a task that we've been using. These aren't too visible, but we present pairs of pictures, and your task is just write whatever you think about this one, and write whatever you think about this one. And we're analyzing what people say. And you can see here, and we're under different pairings, and we're also looking at singletons. So we have a large corpus of data. So here we have a representational piece of art next to a representational piece of art. And here we have representational juxtaposed with an abstract art that happens to have compositional similarities. And the graduate student is super at finding those. She's just brilliant at seeing them and has this large memory. So what happens so we're interested in what happens when you write about these pictures with different juxtapositions. And sure enough, this juxtaposition brings out more general spatial, compositional, abstract features, and less in the way of just listing objects. So you get fewer responses to this when it's paired with an abstract, but the responses are more abstract and compositional, spatial relations, than just the particular objects portrayed. So people just putting that picture next to the other makes you see it differently and think about it differently, which I think any curator implicitly knows, but it's nice to have data. Okay, so it's another way of going abstract. So as we said, finding new ideas, ambiguity helps because it allows you to reinterpret. Experience helps. Experienced architects or designers are better at this than novices. Hints help, especially changing perspective, top-down, thinking of different roles. So on the whole, drawing and drawings are for thinking. Again, this is something all of you, they're not just there to be looked at. They're there to be thought about. And you can guide people, including yourself, to think different ways with different consequences. So I want to just give one small application of this to science. This is another graduate student, Eliza Bobick. She's finished. So she was interested so science is taught through diagrams, tons of them, not always well designed, but it's taught through diagrams. Typically it's tested in language. So we thought, what would happen if we have people students, instead of talking about what they've learned, to draw it. Now drawing, I think, has frightened many people because it's not clear how to analyze them and everybody's drawings are different. So Eliza developed a way of checking what concepts are in the drawings and what concepts are in the visual explanations and comparing them. It's work, but it worked. So she taught, she's a middle school science teacher, or was. She taught kids a lesson in chemical bonding using the usual multimedia sorts of information. Then their knowledge was tested. Then half the group created a visual explanation of chemical bonding, half the group created a verbal explanation of chemical bonding, and they were tested again. What's remarkable is everybody improves without new learning. So creating an explanation somehow consolidates the information and makes you better, even without new teaching. So that's a lesson to us teachers, right? Maybe we need to quiet down a little bit, let them do some work. So, but I'm going to show you some of their explanations. So these are the verbal explanations, one word after another, right? These are the visual, I'm showing you a whole bunch of the visual ones. So we get these lovely metaphors of giving and taking, right? You can see, first of all, that they're totally individual. And they aren't copied from anything they've seen. They're coming from their heads. And they really are charming. So some less than others, some more than others. Here they do step by step, which is useful. We have kind of violent, sharks stealing electrons. Here's more giving. And here's melting pots. So you see a huge amount of creativity in these explanations and fun. I think they had fun doing it. what's more, they did better, so more data. These are the two groups tested before they made the explanation, and the two groups are equal. This is after they made the explanations, and you can see both groups improved, but the visual explain group was much better. Okay, we've replicated that with another concept. So why were the visual explanations better? And I think it's because you have a check for completeness. You can see that all the parts are there. It's harder to do with a list of words. You have a check for coherence. Does it make sense? And do the relations that you've depicted make sense? And then you have a platform for inference. You can see what you've drawn, and it inspires more ideas. Those words, one after another, don't. Maybe if you're a poet again, they do. So again, drawings promote these interactions as well as inferences. We use them for inferences. Again, experts are better at that than novices. So I want to end more or less with just a caveat of where drawings can mislead. So there's been a lot of work, and not so much now, but about 20 years ago, on intuitive physics, looking even at physics graduate students and asking them questions like, there's a ball that enters a tube, a spiral tube, and it comes out, draw the trajectory of the tube, and they present a diagram. Or they say, you're swinging a ball on a string over your head, that's this, and the string breaks, where does the ball go? Okay? So this has been used even with physics graduate students, and a good percentage of them make errors. So they think so you pick which one is right, and it turns out that these are the ones that are right, and they go, whatever gets released goes off at a tangent to the circle, but 30% for the ball on the string pick the spiral circle, and half pick the spiral circle for the ball coming out of the tube, as if that circular motion is going to keep going and the ball is going to keep going in the circle. So half, this is undergraduates, not physics graduates, but undergraduates are not dumb, so this is half. So it turns out if you take away the diagram, people do better. So there's something about this diagram that makes you want to keep going in the circle. Okay? So anyone who's teaching science knows about the misconceptions, the diagram, but I just wanted to bring this to our attention, as it doesn't always work, right? There's something about the drawing that generates a certain kind of thinking that might not work for invisible forces that the world is full of. Okay. So drawing is an interaction of the mind, the hand, the line, and the eye. And it has semantics, dots, lines, and blobs. Doesn't always work. And again, drawing is for discovering, for yourself, for me, for showing and for creating awe. So thank you.